Okay, there's a few other special cases or slices of analysis to point out. The headline here, we've heard people say, just burn the natural gas in the home. It's better than burning it at the power plant and losing energy over the wires. I think what we found here is that that's not true. In fact, because the heat pump, even here where we assume a moderately efficient heat pump with a coefficient of performance of only 2.3, I think many would actually be much better than that. But even if we assume that, the fact that you're getting that 230% efficiency at the point of use makes the electricity a more efficient use of natural gas. So you actually use less natural gas at a power plant to transmit electricity to a heat pump than you do if you just burn it in the home. So that's our takeaway here. Obviously, that goes to zero. The natural gas and the emissions usage goes to zero if it's powered by renewables. I'll only be on this slide briefly, and we can get to more questions later. But there's a whole variety of ways that the heat pumps, including the water heaters, could benefit the electric grid. You can reduce load shedding is like curtailment. This is what a lot of air conditioning demand response programs are now, where the air conditioner just cycles or turns off altogether when the utility sends the right signal. Load shifting is what we modeled, where we're trying to preheat or pre-cool the water or the home. That can be beneficial, especially we saw for water, more limited for space. And there's some more advanced things that could be beneficial, ancillary services like managing the frequency of the grid. This is a suitable use in particular for electric resistance water heaters. It's already used at scale for that in some parts of the country. Heat pump water heaters are not as good at that, maybe a little bit less valuable for them. Or some more sophisticated things with managing the local grid. You could imagine some parts of California where there's so much solar in a neighborhood that the utility won't let a customer add more solar. Well, you could actually have customers preheat all their water in the middle of the day and increase electricity consumption and better manage just at the neighborhood level that solar power. So you could do some creative things like that as well. We didn't model that in our analysis. I have about 3 more analyses to walk through. So this would just be one other case. This is only for water heating. We looked at another example. So in Hawaii, the electricity under their time of use rate is cheapest in the middle of the day. They're already at the point where there's enough solar on the system that they're going to cheaper electricity midday, and we can expect to see more of this in California and Arizona in the future and other places with a lot of solar. But Hawaii is already there now, so we looked at their rate and said, what would be the water heating average profile just across the year? And so it's sort of random if we don't control it there in the top bar. But if we try to load it all up into the middle of the day when electricity is cheap, and then use as little as possible in the evening, we can see in the bottom chart there that we shift a lot of that energy use to the middle of the day. And even though this uses 20% more energy overall in kilowatt hour terms, it's actually 10% cheaper for the customer. So the bottom bar there, the load shifting, it does use more energy on a kilowatt hour basis, but it's definitely cheaper for the customer to do it that way because they're taking the advantage of that cheap electricity. Okay, 2 more special cases. So one, if we go back to that California example and we say, what if a customer combined installing solar panels on their roof at the same time that they did electrification of their space and water heating? And so, these left 2 bars, the gas we saw earlier, was cheaper still for a home retrofit compared to this light green electrification. But now let's combine the installation of solar panels. So it actually becomes much more of an upfront cost. So, you have to consider how would you finance or fund this. But so you add another $15,000 in this case of upfront cost, but over the course of the 15-year study period, you get $25,000 back in energy cost reductions. So the fact that you're combining increased electricity usage with electrification with solar panels, in this California example, actually you come out ahead and even better than natural gas. So, there are some specific opportunities to combine these things that make it more beneficial. And you might even imagine the solar installation companies looking for opportunities to get customers either to electrify space and water heating or to purchase an electric vehicle at the same time and increase their electricity usage and also increase the size of their solar system. Okay, one more sensitivity to highlight here, which is if we actually consider the cost of installing the gas mains and gas services and gas meters at homes, and we imagine what if, because we envision all electric buildings, we could defer all of that gas infrastructure cost. How does that change things? Well, we show here again these are the Oakland numbers, but the orange bar here represents those incremental gas costs. We find that there's a wide range. There's so many factors that influence how much it costs to bring gas to a home. But, on average, the incremental impact we estimate is here is $7,400 for the retrofit scenario. Particularly, this is because a lot of homes that don't already have gas are, maybe the reason they don't have it, they may be far from the existing gas system. And so it can be quite expensive, and this again can turn the tables on the economic analysis, and you can avoid all of that cost of the gas infrastructure. You could imagine other cases where this might be relevant. So we know recently in Massachusetts, given the gas explosions in several communities there, we've heard about the commitments to fund major new investments in replacing gas mains. Well, this raises the prospect of could those tens of millions of dollars go toward alternatives like switching those customers to all electric systems and upgrading their homes to accommodate that. So I've got about 2 slides left. So we ended with 5 recommendations. One is to prioritize propane and heating oil just because it's a more attractive target than gas economically and from a carbon point of view. Second would be to actually stop supporting the expansion of gas to new homes. So as we continue to build out gas mains and gas services to brand new neighborhoods, we're locking those homes in the gas usage effectively, or making it much more expensive to go back and retrofit them later. Third is to bundle, not to do electrification by itself, but to bundle these things like demand flexibility, rate designs, and especially energy efficiency together with electrification. Fourth is, expand demand flex for existing electric space and water heating, especially since many of these are resistance-based systems. You could get some value in particular out of the water heating loads. And fifth, change how we measure energy efficiency. So, utilities have to achieve kilowatt-hour based targets, reduce energy usage. But if we're actually talking about benefiting from switching from gas to electric, we need to change the metrics here. Energy use itself or kilowatt-hour use itself is not really the relevant metric. It should be either about emissions or about dollars or potentially about some cross-fuel total energy use, which allows you to reduce gas usage while you're increasing electricity usage. And then lastly, here are some of the alternative views we've heard. I would characterize broadly from the gas industry, including from a report from the American Gas Association, that saying that electrification is too expensive and doesn't have enough carbon benefits. My reaction is that they they tend to use pessimistic assumptions. Don't assume any efficiency improvements. Use the heat pumps in cold climates that are not well suited to cold climates, and so that tends to skew their results towards showing a high cost. The second alternative we've heard is to actually substitute renewable gas, and that way you can just keep using the existing gas infrastructure. It's maybe simpler than switching homes from gas to electricity. My concerns would be that there's the biomethane from landfills and wastewater and cow pastures, dairy farms is actually limited compared to the total amount of gas we need. And alternatives like hydrogen or power to gas might be technically feasible, but it's unclear what their costs are, and they may be very expensive, and they need more research. And lastly, that ground source heat pumps should be our alternative instead of air source heat pumps, in particular for cold climates, where air source heat pumps may not work as efficiently. My reaction is that I'm hopeful that this technology becomes more cost effective. I think the fact that it can cost $20,000 or $30,000 up front for a home tends to be prohibitive, but it may have application, and especially in the coldest climates. If you're in northern Maine or northern Minnesota, you may not really be able to rely only on an air source heat. You won't be able to rely only on an air source heat pump without some backup resistance. So ground source heat pump will be particularly attractive in those coldest climates, and I'm hopeful that the innovations in that industry continue. All right, well, that's the end of the presentation, so I'd love to turn to questions and discussion.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. We've definitely got plenty of time for questions here. And before we get to those, just a big thanks to all of our main sponsors: T-Stud, structurally insulated wall stud assemblies, Mitsubishi All-Electric, going all-electric in your HVAC systems for air source heat pumps, and Shrinergy on the go, and in your home or in your building, backup microgrid solutions. Big thanks to all of our members, our sponsors, and our board of directors. We couldn't do it without you. So some very specific questions that came in here, and I'm going to kind of add to this one a little bit, but in new construction, what is the avoided cost for not having to install the natural gas infrastructure? What is the added cost, if any, for having to add additional electrical infrastructure, such as a larger panel? And then adding to that a little bit, I mean, to my knowledge, knocking out the venting needed for gas, you can improve the air changes per hour in a home, which can reduce the cost. So did you factor in any of that, or have any additional thoughts to share there?
Yeah, we considered some of that in various ways. So we consider the direct cost of the venting itself in the scenarios when comparing for new construction, when comparing gas versus electric, and so that's sort of incorporated into the numbers we saw earlier. The avoided cost of the gas infrastructure, we showed a number in the retrofit scenario that the incremental cost was $7,400, but could vary quite widely. I think the average for new construction, again, it's so variable depending on how far the community is from the existing infrastructure, and even on the terrain and soil and everything. But I would approximate on average it's a little bit less than the $7,500. It's probably in the $3,000 or $4,000, $5,000 range per home, just for the gas infrastructure. For electrical infrastructure, at the home, we'd certainly expect that a home with a 100 amp panel cannot really fully electrify. But our expectation is that most homes in most parts of the country, most new homes, are getting at least a 200 amp service anyway, and that should be adequate to electrify. So for new homes, for the most part, they'll have enough capacity in that panel to not need a higher panel than they otherwise would. the exception might be, I mean, if they're really going overboard, full electric heating and water heating and 2 electric vehicles and a hot tub, you can certainly see how they could exceed that. But just for an efficient heat pump and water heating, I think 200 amp would be enough. That the panel becomes relevant for retrofits, certainly if a home has a smaller service and needs to upgrade the panel in order to do the electrification, that can easily add $2,000 or $3,000 onto their cost and be a big difference.
Why do you feel it's correct to assign the marginal CO2 to electrification instead of the average?
Yeah, so both of those have flaws. So we kind of considered three ways of doing it. One is the average. Just say the mix is, whatever, 20% nuclear, 30% coal, et cetera, and just assign that. The second, which we chose, was the 5 minute by 5 minutes, which power plant is turning up or down just a little bit. The third conceptual one, which would be the best, is the long-term, I would call the long-term marginal. So if we added a whole bunch of homes with electric heating, what would be the long-term impact? And we'd evaluate which new power plants actually get built to accommodate that, which plants run more or less over the course of 10 or 15 years. That would be the gold standard. Because that involves modeling the entire grid, that was beyond the scope of what we did. But, between, there's some examples where we would expect that the average mix would not be a great way to look at things. An example which we did not use was in the Pacific Northwest, where the average is really dominated by hydropower, but they're not really building any new dams, and so meeting any new energy demand is not going to come from hydropower. So this would be an extreme example of saying if we assume a 90% hydro system, we have almost no emissions, but in reality, adding electric demand is today in that region is adding a lot of natural gas usage. So it would be more accurate to look at something like gas. I recognize the marginal thing is not perfect either. It shows us that Chicago is all coal, for instance, and we expect that's actually changing. But we think it's slightly better than using the average emissions.
Was the TOU cost escalation applied over 15 years?
A cost escalation, as in the electric rate going up over time? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So no, we didn't apply that. But intentionally. So I mean, historically, electricity rates, the nominal rate has gone up, but if you adjust for inflation, just nationally, the average electricity rate has been relatively consistent, or even if you go back to the 50s and 60s as your baseline, has actually gone down over the long term. So we stuck with real dollars, or you can think of it as inflation adjusted. And there, on those terms, we assume that electricity rates and gas rates, in this case, are relatively flat. And so we did not apply an escalator.
Was the watt time data available to incorporate into the Energy Plus models directly, or was it evaluated post-Energy model?
It was evaluated post. So the Energy Plus gave us the heating loads, heating and cooling actually loads, and we extracted those from Energy Plus. And so we ended up with the kilowatt hours of demand by time interval throughout the year, and then we just applied the emissions rate outside Energy Plus.
When talking about changing out gas furnaces with air source heat pumps, and just kind of stopping short there, what about concerns of comfort and having to use, especially in colder climates, having to use backup strip heaters If the only thing that's done on a renovation is that the the air source heat pump is added, but nothing else is done to the shell of the home.
Right. There's several considerations there. I mean, as a general principle, in a cold climate, we can assert that you would not want to replace a furnace with an air source heat pump in a cold climate in a poorly sealed and poorly insulated building without any other work. You could anticipate that it would be, you would risk discomfort and dissatisfaction for that customer. So in practice, you would want, there's kind of two options. One is just to oversize the heat pump to compensate. The other would be to actually do an efficiency upgrade, or ideally like an air sealing upgrade to make the home more efficient. And so just from our conversations with practitioners who've actually done this, that, it sounds like that's really the approach that's been shown to work. In our analysis, we didn't have a very poorly insulated home. We had new homes which were well sealed and well insulated, and we had retrofit homes which we would consider average. And so in both of those cases, for the average home, we ended up sizing the heat pump to meet the heating demand at all times throughout the year. So, we might be borderline there. Maybe that house would actually benefit more from a comfort point of view of other upgrades. But we sized the heat pump appropriately in our analysis and showed that in these climates, including Chicago and Providence, which are cold but not the very coldest, with the very best cold climate heat pump technology, you could operate the entire year without needing your backup resistance element. So just to reiterate, I guess, the entire year throughout the entire winter in Chicago, it was actually, I see you have Mitsubishi listed there. We used their specs for their newest products that can meet the home's needs as cold as 13 below Fahrenheit. And in our test year with the weather data, it didn't get below that temperature, so we were able to meet all that without using a resistance backup.
How about incentives? Were those taken into account at all in the study?
So we left out incentives intentionally to say, well, to consider if there's a differential for gas and electric, you could look at that and say, well, what incentive would you need to make up the difference? So we did it without incentives to just be a little cleaner, and then you could obviously add incentives on top of that.
Yeah. So what about so a lot of times the argument, of course, is we can't do this because of the line loss, transmission loss from the power plants. And obviously it seems like you've articulated that you've all considered that highly in this study. But, going in the other direction, I always say back, well, have you considered the natural gas loss, in leakage, during extraction, storage, transportation? Was that factored into your study at all?
Yes, that was another sensitivity which did not appear in the slides, but is in the full study from a carbon emissions point of view. So we know that natural gas is essentially methane, that when it leaks directly into the air, and that has a much more significant impact on climate change. And so that's very concerning, obviously. So we did, if you searched and went to the full report, you would find that sensitivity. But for instance, in Chicago, even where we showed the coal-based electricity doing much worse environmentally than natural gas, if you consider all the leakage, that turns into basically a break even. So, natural gas, considering all the methane leakage, ends up being roughly break even in that case with powering the entire heat pump off of coal. So it does make a big difference. And the related thing there is that, some strategies would have you have a customer switch out maybe both space and water heating, but leave a natural gas cooking, a natural gas range in their home. And the implication, especially for policymakers to consider, is that a desirable outcome? Because that leaves that home connected to the natural gas system. It still requires the entire system, even though cooking in a residence is a much lower usage and volume of natural gas. Still requires that whole system to deliver it. That whole system has leaks and safety issues and maintenance costs and fixed costs. So that's sort of a longer term consideration. If this is going to happen at scale, it probably has to happen. It probably has to include cooking, because it probably won't make sense to keep the entire system just for residential cooking with gas.
Yeah, and the response we always have to that is go check out induction. Anyway, is there so you had mentioned kind of this idea where, and we face this in our state, where you can only legally buy so much solar, and then eventually you can't get any more. But if you electrify, you increase your demand, so you can get more solar. Going a little bit further, what about storage? Storing energy, batteries, all of that. How can that play into help or hurt the electrification of buildings? And to the question here is, do you plan to maybe release any studies on battery storage and electrification?
Yeah, we don't have any existing work that combines those two. There is other RMI work on battery storage, but I'll say, storage offers a couple potential benefits. So the first if we look nationally just at storage itself, the most prominent thing right now is that it offers resilience. I know you mentioned at the beginning that RMI is working in Puerto Rico, and obviously, in that particular case, we see almost 100% of customers who are putting in solar are combining it with storage, and because no one wants to be without power for 3 months or 6 months. But across most of the rest of the U.S., that use case is pretty small. There's not that many people doing it. But the other benefit it could have, together with electrification, would be to manage peak energy consumption. So, one concern that we hear and we recognize, in particular in cold climates, is that if everyone goes to fully electric heating in a place like, Montana, Wisconsin, New York, then on the coldest morning of the year, that's going to become the peak of the electric system demand. And it's going to require new generation to meet that peak. It may require upgrades in the transmission system or even in the local neighborhood level electricity system. And that all may be very costly. So the value that storage could have in particular in that case is to help shift that peak. Even where we showed it was kind of hard in a hot climate or a cold climate to shift the space heating or space cooling load by preheating and pre-cooling. Well, a battery could do that quite effectively. And so that may become an attractive use case in the future.
Great. Well, I've got one more sort of call to action question to give you, and then one other thing to showcase, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up because I don't see any other questions. But are we facing a chicken or an egg issue here with discussing the cleaner grid? So if we're specifically talking to sort of consumers or builders or architects on the local level who can implement these changes now on a smaller basis, does it confuse them to ask them to consider the state of the current grid when looking to move to recommending all electric? Should they be waiting, or should they focus on getting involved in advocacy work for a clean grid, with the time that they have?
That's very location dependent. So I would say if you're in California, I think it's quite clear that cleaning up the grid is happening. They've now, or if you're in Hawaii, Hawaii is a little bit of a special case, but they've already passed 100%. It's clear, it's moving. Or really, if you're in most of New England, it's already, that's already written into law in one way or another. So there certainly is advocacy work to do, but it's clear that the system is moving in that direction. And so I think they're already at the point where you can say it's a benefit now, and that benefit's only going to get better environmentally. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're in, a state where if you're in Chicago, for instance, I think we can anticipate, or if you're in Texas, or if you're in Wisconsin, I think we can anticipate that the trend of retiring coal is going to continue. And we've shown here that even if the grid was entirely natural gas, there would already be a benefit. So I think, nationally, things are moving in the direction where the power grid is actually cleaning up. And if we look across the economy at what's not cleaning up, it's transportation, it's industry, it's buildings, fossil fuel use in buildings. So the electric grid is actually the one that's the success story and already making progress and is likely to continue. Mm-hmm. So even in Chicago, I think it's only a matter of a few years to really see that shift.
Mm-hmm. And real quick before we wrap up, I wanted to point out this Facebook group here that's open to the public. It's called Electrify Everything, and it's a fantastic group of folks who are joining every day to just have this conversation on electrifying our homes, our cars, and our building. And it's very technical, a lot of great discussion on here, so you can check that out if you want. But right before we wrap up, Mike, where can people find out information, contact you, or get the study if they want to learn more?
Sure. Well, my email is on the screen there, mhenshin@rmi.org. If you just Google economics of electrifying buildings, you will easily find this report, and you're welcome to contact me or navigate to rmi.org and search our reports there.
All right, great. Well, Mike, thanks for your time. Thanks to the Rocky Mountain Institute for continuing to do all this fantastic work. We'll keep track of everything you're doing, and have a great rest of your week, everybody. Take care.